Welcome to the annual meeting of the Arms Control Association. I'm here with a great deal of happiness and pride. First, happy to see so many of our supporters, to see so many people who realize the urgent questions around weapons of mass destruction that the U.S. continues to confront on a daily basis. I think of this group and a couple hundred more who are online as an emotional support group for those of us working in the field, and I'm grateful for that. I'm also very proud of the team at the Arms Control Association, the staff that we have. They make sound recommendations on national security policy that help to reduce the threat of the use of nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction. They work with the public to build awareness of the continuing dangers that our country and the world face. They join and sometimes lead a coalition of equally dedicated arms control and grassroots groups around the country and indeed internationally. And one of the recent products of this coalition work we'll talk about later today, and that is our recent urgent call to halt and reverse the nuclear arms race. And the staff all does that with a very small staff. They are incredible, hardworking, brilliant people. And I and the other members of the board of directors can't thank them enough. And we do it through the support of donors, both major foundations and individuals, whether they are a member at a lower level of donation, but some very significant larger donors as well. And we will have an opportunity both to thank them and then to give you the hard sell to join or to increase your annual donation. We're together today at yet another crucial moment. It does seem in this line of work that every moment is a crucial turning point. It does seem that although we have few advances in the arms control arena to celebrate, we've done the crucial job of trying to maintain the international guardrails that protect us from proliferation, protect us from the threat of nuclear war. We do our best with partners all around the world to keep the world from sliding backwards into a still more dangerous moment. And yet this is a crucial moment right here. The topics that we're going to cover today are in the news today. We welcome what President Putin has said, essentially endorsing what the ACA and other groups have been arguing for a couple of years, that it is essential to have an extension of the terms, if not the treaty itself, of the terms of the New START treaty before it expires in February. And we look forward to seeing a positive response from the United States to that idea. We are on the eve of a snapback of sanctions on Iran, which would be perhaps the last nail in the coffin of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, with very little clarity about what comes next. But we will try in one of our panels today to delve into that question. And we will also talk about where is the American public on these issues? What do we care about? What are people worried about? And is there more that can be done to educate, inform, and mobilize the American people about the choices that are being made in their name? So it's an exciting program, and I thank you all again for coming here today. One of the issues that I have watched closely over the last 20 years is the interest of the United States Congress in these issues. There was a time when both the Senate and the House had literally dozens of members, of leaders who were informed and interested and active on issues of non-proliferation and nuclear weapons policy. I've seen that number gradually decline. I've seen a distressing decrease in the interest that members have in this topic. It's a pleasure to introduce one of those people who is sustaining the interest, the knowledge, and the active involvement that all of us should want to see from both the House and the Senate. Chris Van Hollen is in his second term as a senator from Maryland, where I reside. He has been interested in our issues throughout this time. He has introduced legislation back in 2019 urging the extension of New START at that time. He has kept a watchful eye on conventional arms transfer and the policies of both the Biden and the Trump administration regarding transfers of conventional weapons to the Middle East. And he is a member of a group that Arms Control Association is happy to advise, the Bicameral Nuclear Weapons and Arms Control Working Group. I don't think there's a better person from the Congress to address these issues with us today. And I am proud to welcome Senator Van Hollen, and I ask you to welcome him as well.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. Thank you, first of all, for that introduction. It's wonderful to have you as a constituent. It's always a good idea to have a constituent introduce you as a member of Congress. You never know when they need their road plowed or when. But seriously, most of all, Tom, I want to thank you for your years of public service and for your leadership here as chairman of the Arms Control Association. If we can give Tom a big round of applause. And I also want to thank your entire team. As you said, it may not be large in numbers, but it is large in terms of output and brain power. And I salute your stellar CEO, Daryl Kimball, and the others who are part of this effort. So thank you all very much. I have to say it's great to get off of Capitol Hill. It's especially good to be off of Capitol Hill and with you to discuss these very important issues. I should say a brief word about the other issue that is gripping Washington right now, and that is the rising prospect of a government shutdown due to President Trump's demand that he get a blank check from the Congress and his refusal to turn off a ticking time bomb on America's health care at the end of this year if we don't diffuse it. I hope we can work all of that out. We're here, of course, today to talk about a different ticking time bomb, the risks of a nuclear conflict and the total devastation that it would bring. The doomsday clock was established by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists 78 years ago in the wake of World War II. And it now stands at 89 seconds to midnight, the closest to global catastrophe it has ever been. For over 50 years, you at the Arms Control Association have worked to prevent that clock from reaching catastrophic nuclear midnight. Indeed, you have been very focused on trying to move the hands of that clock backwards so that we reduce the risks of nuclear catastrophe. Back in 1983, and I'm dating myself here, I read a New Yorker series called The Fate of the Earth by Jonathan Schell. His article spelled out in graphic detail how a nuclear conflagration would be the end of life on Earth as we know it. It was so alarming that I decided to try to do my part to prevent it. I became very involved in the movement for nuclear arms control in college and in graduate school. From there, I went to work on these issues in the United States Senate, first as a staff member for arms control and defense to former Maryland Senator Mac Mathias, who was a major proponent of nuclear arms control, and later as a member of the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I'm now a senator on that committee, and while much has changed in those intervening years, one thing remains the same. A global nuclear war would effectively end life on Earth as we know it. And so when the consequences of failure are so high and so catastrophic, it behooves us to think of all the ways we can prevent it. And that, of course, is what you do here at the Arms Control Association. And it's been an honor to work with you over that entire period of time, from the time I was a staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to my time as a member of that committee now. You know, back then, we had a simpler world. Militarily and politically, it was a bipolar world. You had two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, each developing large nuclear arsenals. There was a balance of nuclear terror, the threat of mutual assured destruction, MAD, and that was the essence of deterrence. It would take much too long to discuss all the ways that nuclear doctrine has evolved over the years. But one thing that has changed is we do live now in a more complicated, multipolar world with more nuclear powers and the threat of more nuclear proliferation to come. And stopping the proliferation of nuclear weapons, which increases the risk of catastrophic miscalculation, must be a top priority. The conflict in May of this year between nuclear-armed India and Pakistan was a sober reminder of the risks of a conflict that could escalate to the use of nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, in the midst of Russia's brutal war against Ukraine, Putin and others in Russia have made reckless threats about the use of nuclear weapons. Totally irresponsible. And Russia has been intruding recently on the airspace of NATO countries like Estonia and Poland. As they do that, the risk of miscalculation rises. Elsewhere in the world, from Iran to North Korea and beyond, we see the existing nuclear nonproliferation and arms control regime frame. In his United Nations speech, President Trump said that he wanted sweeping denuclearization. I would support an effort to achieve that goal, but he has yet to advance any proposals. It is more vital than ever that the President pursue and Congress support nuclear arms control diplomacy with Iran, with Russia, with China, with North Korea, and others to reduce the risk of war, better manage the strategic competition, and reduce the dangers posed by the world's most lethal weapons. No case is more pressing at the moment than dealing with Iran's nuclear program, and Tom mentioned you'll be focused on that here today. The JCPOA, which was brokered between the United States, Iran, and some of our partners in 2015, was not perfect, but it did provide essential safeguards, essential guardrails against Iran's developing a nuclear weapon. The first Trump administration recklessly pulled out of that agreement in 2018, and not surprisingly, that resulted in Iran reducing its compliance with the agreement. In the event of noncompliance, the JCPOA has a mechanism called the snapback provision for the UN Security Council to reimpose UN sanctions on Iran. And you all follow this very closely. You probably know that last week at the initiative of the E3, France, Britain, and Germany, the UN Security Council voted to trigger that provision. And unless the UN Security Council acts to reverse it by September 28th, so just 3 days from today, the UN prohibitions against Iranian enrichment, restrictions on arms transfers, and redesignation of individuals and entities connected to Iran's nuclear and missile programs will be reimposed. Following the war, between Israel and Iran and the Trump administration's attack on Iranian nuclear facilities, the Iranian government barred the IAEA inspectors from assessing nuclear facilities. Then in early September, prior to the UN Security Council vote on snapback, the IAEA and Iran had reached an agreement in principle that inspectors could return to conduct on-site inspections. It did not include a clear timeline, but it was a step in the right direction that needed to be pursued. However, after the UN Security Council voted for the snapback provisions, Iran once again suspended its cooperation with the IAEA. I have long supported the goal of ensuring that Iran never obtains a nuclear weapon. But bombing is not, in my view, the best and certainly not the most sustainable way of achieving that goal. President Trump said again during his speech at the UN General Assembly that the strike on the Iranian nuclear sites had obliterated them, but I have yet to see evidence of that. We know from public reporting that a Defense Intelligence Agency assessment found that the strikes only set back Iran's nuclear program by a few months. The head of DIA was later fired because that assessment did not fit into the president's narrative. And I should say that this is a very dangerous development when you begin to see professionals in the U.S. government, here, the Defense Department, we're also seeing it at the CIA and other intelligence agencies. When people are punished because their factual findings do not fit the narrative of the President of the United States, that is a recipe for miscalculation, disaster, and just getting bad information that leads to bad decisions for our country. On top of that assessment, we also know that the strike was conducted against the backdrop of a U.S. intelligence assessment that Iran was not pursuing a nuclear weapon, which is an assessment that has not changed since the year 2007. Amid all of this, I believe the door to diplomacy is not yet shut. The United States, the E3, and Iran should move swiftly to restart negotiations on a pragmatic, effective nuclear agreement. If not, there's increased risk that Iran will resume, certainly at some point, sensitive nuclear activities and a new military crisis between Israel, the United States, and Iran could erupt. With bold and decisive leadership, the E3, Washington, and Tehran can still give diplomacy time to work and avert the risk of another escalatory spiral. And the Arms Control Association, to its credit, has advanced some constructive proposals on the best way forward. I want to now turn to a less immediate but increasingly pressing risk regarding the impending expiration of the New START agreement with Russia, which is set to terminate in February of next year. This termination date is looming as Putin continues his brutal war against Ukraine. President Trump, of course, said he would bring that war to an end on day one, but in my view, his efforts to cozy up and appease Putin have only further emboldened Putin. From comments made just in the last 48 hours, President Trump appears to realize that, but we will see what comes next. I do believe that even amidst the ongoing war in Ukraine, it remains in America's interest to maintain a nuclear arms control regime with Russia. And President Trump has said repeatedly that he wants talks with Putin on the denuclearization of the massive Russian and U.S. nuclear arsenals. If that's to succeed, we should start now. 3 days ago, as Tom mentioned, Putin said Russia would adhere to the New START treaty for 1 year, beginning at its expiration date, February 5th, 2026. So he agreed to extend that for a year, meaning Russia would comply with it. This is a very important signal, in my view, and one that the Trump administration should reciprocate. Senator Markey and I and others said as much in a letter that we sent to the administration in February of this year. That is a small but important step, I believe, to prevent unintended consequences and escalation. Both leaders should also pursue negotiations now to hammer out details of a follow-on agreement. Starting now would make a lot of sense, given the situation we're in. And those negotiations can include, among other things, discussions of Russia's development of new types of intermediate range missiles, as well as some new strategic systems, including hypersonic missiles designed to bypass U.S. defense capabilities. While the United States and Russia have by far the largest nuclear arsenals in the world, China's nuclear arsenal is the fastest growing, rising to about 600 warheads at the beginning of the year, about 100 more year to year. Now, China has resisted efforts to draw it into nuclear arms control discussions with the United States and Russia, arguing that its arsenal remains small in comparison, which it is. But I believe we should seek to pursue bilateral discussions with China to prevent misunderstanding and miscalculation. We did see a small opening under the Biden administration where China was willing to engage on nuclear issues bilaterally. Those talks did not progress far, but the precedent was important, and I believe we should revive those discussions. In addition to pursuing arms control discussions with Russia and China and working on the nonproliferation issues, we should also do our part here at home to avoid a costly arms race. I'm all for the reasonable modernization of our nuclear arsenal. You need to keep it up to date. But we do not need to engage in wasteful spending that does not achieve that goal. And it's clear that administrations from both parties have invested in wasteful and unnecessary programs. For years, administrations, Democrats and Republicans, have invested in the Sentinel program, which would replace the existing force of Minuteman III ICBMs, despite it being much more expensive than simply extending the life of the Minuteman program. Last year, the Defense Department announced that the program had breached what is known as the Nunn-McCurdy threshold. This is a limit designed to prevent huge cost overruns in major defense acquisition programs. It reported a new cost estimate for the Sentinel of $140 billion, which was an 81% spike since the previous estimate. Add to that other programs like the Nuclear Sea-Launched Cruise Missile Program, the SLCM program, to the list of costly, redundant, and potentially destabilizing programs, and you see a series of expenditures that do not achieve, in my view, the goals that we seek. I have for years proposed an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Bill to strike the sea-launched, the SLCM, nuclear SLCM. Unfortunately, despite the fact that way back in the Obama administration, they tried to phase it out, this thing keeps going on. The same is true of President Trump's proposed Golden Dome missile shield. A continental-scale layered intercepted network would be a budgetary sink, running to hundreds of billions, maybe trillions of dollars, without achieving its intended purpose. And that's the main point. It is simply a revival of President Reagan's proposed Strategic Defense Initiative, popularly known as Star Wars. It is one thing to have systems designed for limited area defense or to intercept missiles from a minor adversary. That I support. But we know from the failed Star Wars experience that the costs of overwhelming such a defense system are far less than the costs of trying to maintain it. I was very involved back in the Star Wars debate when I was a staff member on the Hill, and I remember the arguments back and forth well. And the reality is that Star Wars Strategic Defense Initiative ended up as we predicted, not being able to prove itself capable of providing that kind of strategic defense on any kind of cost-effective basis. And that would be the same of this proposal as well. The Congressional Budget Office, just in April of this year, issued its latest 10-year cost projection for the Departments of Defense and the Department of Energy, and their plans to operate, sustain, and modernize existing U.S. nuclear forces and purchase of new forces. A total of $946 billion in the 2025 to 2034 period, about $95 billion a year, which in my view is a huge, unnecessary cost to the American people. Again, I am supportive of nuclear modernization efforts. I'm not supportive of efforts that are expensive and do not achieve our goals in a cost-effective way for the American people. While the Arms Control Association has been a decades-long champion on nuclear arms control and non-proliferation efforts, I was also glad to see your recent statements on the need to ensure that our conventional arms transfer policies comply with U.S. law and international humanitarian law. That's why I work closely with the Biden administration to codify international humanitarian law requirements for conventional arms sales into what became known as National Security Memorandum 20, or NSM 20. I worked many, many days, weeks to accomplish that with the Biden administration, and I thought it was a pretty good project, and I think it was a pretty good result in writing. The idea was pretty straightforward. When U.S. taxpayers fund and supply weapons to a foreign government, that government must promise to use those weapons in compliance with U.S. and international law, and it created a mechanism for the enforcement of those obligations. Unfortunately, the Biden administration did not enforce the provisions of its own directive, and the Trump administration tore it up as soon as they came into office. Americans deserve to know that their taxpayer dollars going to other countries are being used in accordance with American law and American values. And I will continue to fight for that principle, and I'm glad to have the support of the Arms Control Association in that cause. You, the Arms Control Association, have years of experience that you bring to these important questions. And I want to thank you because I do believe your efforts have helped us prevent some of the bad things we might have otherwise done in this country and this world. But you also know that that clock is closer than ever to nuclear midnight, and that we have a lot more work to do. As I said earlier, much has changed since the time I was a staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations to becoming a member of that committee, but one thing remains the same, and that is the joint statement made by Russian leader Mikhail Gorbachev and President Ronald Reagan in Geneva 30 years ago. And I quote, "A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought." That is the mission of the Arms Control Association, and I look forward to continue to work with you in that mission and to help build a more peaceful and prosperous world. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Senator, for what you have said and now for your willingness to endure a few questions. I will ask two questions. If anyone in the audience has a question, they should jot it down on one of the handy notepads, and our ACA staff will collect them and pass them to me. Let me start with the statements by President Trump concerning his interest in genuine denuclearization, in reducing the nuclear budget, the nuclear arsenal. We have welcomed those statements, and we should welcome them. My concern is manifold, but let me just mention first that the team is not there. I don't know who is in charge of any nuclear policy at the National Security Council. The best people with experience in negotiating with both Russia and China are no longer in the State Department. Some of them are here today. But my other concern is on many things that the president says, members of his own party are quick to praise those statements. I have not heard any members of his party line up behind him and say, we agree on the need for denuclearization, for arms control. So my question is, how seriously can we take the president's intent? And can we count on the Congress to be supportive of any effort that goes in that direction?
So, Tom, like you, I was pleased to see the statements, both in terms of denuclearization, as well as an effort to deal with the Biological Weapons Convention, both things that he mentioned in his UN remarks the other day. You know, I'm skeptical of the capacity to implement it, even if the will were there. And for the reasons you said, you know, we have seen just a chainsaw taken to many of the capabilities we have in the U.S. government in terms of people who work on these issues. And if you're serious about launching something like this, you obviously need to build a team that shares the goals and has the expertise. Let's say that did happen. You know, my experience on the Hill is if this is something that Donald Trump wanted to make a priority and wanted to advance, you'd have a lot of Republicans falling in line. I'm talking about if he really wanted to press it. I mean, that's the pattern on everything else. I mean, I'm not going to go into great detail, but I think you can observe that Republicans in Congress have, in my view, essentially surrendered their constitutional duties to Donald Trump. In many areas, that would be a big problem. But I guess what I'm saying is if Donald Trump really wanted to make this an initiative, I think he could. And frankly, the idea of denuclearization is one that can capture the imagination of the American people. I mean, I remember when Ronald Reagan went to Reykjavik and talked about a world without nuclear weapons. That also, I think, captured the imagination of many people. And as you know, President Reagan ended up entering into some important agreements with the Soviets at the time, the Soviet Union. So this is a long way of saying that if he really was committed to it, I think he could get support in the Congress. But I'm not convinced that one statement at the end of a UN General Assembly speech is a real commitment.
Thank you. And keep the questions coming. They're already great. My second question relates to budget. You noted the Congressional Budget Office estimate of spending at least $95 billion a year from the federal budget on the nuclear weapons complex. And that, of course, does not include a topic that we'll cover later today, the Golden Dome proposal, that puts us well over $100 billion a year, about the amount that was recently taken from healthcare programs in the U.S. What I'm interested in, well, what I see is all of one party and enough of another party are gung-ho for ever-increasing nuclear spending. And I'm wondering if you see that dynamic changing and the Congress taking a more critical look at nuclear weapons budgets in the next few years.
Well, Tom, there's what I would like to see, and then there's what's happening now. Probably is no surprise to all of you to know that the military-industrial complex is alive and well in today's America. Eisenhower warned about it years ago, and we continue to see that pattern. I mean, we've seen weapon systems like the nuclear slickums that administrations in the past have not wanted, that Congress then foisted upon the administration. Now, the Trump administration has embraced that. But I would like to see a much more focus on these issues. I think we need to take a much bigger spotlight to the nuclear weapons programs, as well as other conventional programs at the Defense Department. I think people know that the Defense Department is the one federal government agency that has never passed an audit. I think the American people don't fully recognize, and we need to talk more about this, that over half of discretionary spending is on defense. Half of discretionary spending, right? So if you take off the table Medicare and Social Security and those kind of programs, the year-to-year annual appropriations is over 50% defense. That does not include money on other security programs like Homeland Security. That doesn't include domestic law enforcement. That doesn't include the services that we provide to the men and women who served us, the Veterans Administration. So my view is that we need to reform that entire procurement system, and that as part of that, we need to look long and hard at the nuclear modernization program and separate out what we need to achieve our goals of deterrence and what is a waste of taxpayer money, given all those other priorities that you're talking about, including a whopping big deficit and increasing debt levels. So there's a lot of room for improvement here. I do think this is going to get more attention in the coming months. Many of us are really focused on. I don't serve on the Armed Services Committee. I serve on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I do serve on the Appropriations Committee, though. And this is an area that I think is very fruitful for more engagement. I'll end with this. I think drawing the public into this conversation can be very important, because when this kind of spending goes on automatic pilot, outside of public scrutiny, then that's when you see more wasteful spending. So I do hope we will up our efforts to shine a spotlight on this.
Okay, thank you. I have so many excellent questions from the audience that we are canceling the rest of the program, keeping the senator all afternoon. I'm going to read 3 related questions. Don't feel like you have to answer each in detail, but I think they're excellent questions and related to each other. First, how do you suggest we incentivize our own representatives in the Congress to engage in sensible nuclear policies? What is the most effective advocacy you have seen or been part of on nuclear issues, and what can we learn about this today? And what do you suggest students and young people do? So any pieces
Sure.
of
Well,
those?
there's a common thread there,
Yes.
Tom. I do believe that members of Congress pay attention to what their constituents are saying. And so I do think the public education piece of this is very important. And the Arms Control Association plays a very important role in that. Other organizations do as well. But I do think that the message that you have here, the Arms Control Association, needs to get out more widely among the American people. And I think that will cause more of them to bring this attention to their members. You can do that directly as well But you mentioned the cost factor. I mean, that is having a direct impact on the American people and American taxpayers. Bringing those kind of issues to their attention, especially when you can make the argument that not only is something wasteful spending, but it's actually potentially destabilizing, not actually serving their security interests. I think we need a more organized grassroots effort to accomplish that. And students can be a very important part of that effort, because I believe until this issue becomes more pronounced among American voters, it's going to be harder to get a lot of members to focus on it. I mean, I talked about, the 1980s and the focus on this. I mean, during the middle of the Cold War, with the U.S. and the Soviet Union, armed to the teeth in terms of their nuclear weapons, there was a great deal of focus on that. So, someone like me, who was, in school and high school and looking at the different issues and challenges around the world, this was front and center. And because we don't have that sort of bipolar world where every day in the news there's not something about the balance of terror, mutually assured destruction, and these two big arsenals, that public role, that public spotlight has been diminished, even as the dangers have not. And so that is the challenge, is to let people know that the dangers have not receded, even though there's less public spotlight on it. So that's a long way of saying we need to work to find a way to put more attention on this issue. You can do it here in Washington, and that's important. But the more the American public is informed of the costs and the challenges, the better off we'll be.
Thanks. I mean, I note that Arms Control Association is not a grassroots group, but I have so much admiration for those across the country who are working on these issues, and there's literally hundreds of such groups that we try to work with and for. Let me ask this question to go further on Iron Dome. Given your concern over nuclear conflict, why are you opposed to Golden Dome?
Well, let me just say, if I thought that Golden Dome could actually work, meaning provide a impervious defense to incoming missiles in large scale, then I would obviously support that. I mean, I would support that. But I think we know that that's not what the result will be. And we know that from experience. And we know that because of what we would do if one of our adversaries wanted to try to put up some version of it. We would make sure that we had the capacity through our offensive systems to overwhelm it. And we know from experience and basic math that it is cheaper, much cheaper to overwhelm a system like that than to be able to have such a system keep pace with the threat. This is exactly why SDI, Star Wars, never materialized. And again, I am not opposed to using, obviously, missile defense for area defense. I'm not opposed to putting in place systems that could intercept, a minor adversary. I mean, we've talked about, like if North Korea wanted to launch a missile at the United States, and they've threatened to, use their missile capacity to have a system that could intercept that. But that is a very different thing than being able to develop a system that can prevent, for example, Russia from being able to attack us. And the reason that would also obviously undermine the offensive nuclear missile regimes. I mean, this is, the ABM treaty back in the day was there for a reason. We obviously no longer have the ABM treaty, but you could be sure that if, for example, today, Russia decided to try to deploy its own Golden Dome, we would break out of the New START agreement. You're not going to get a New START agreement, unlikely to get a New START agreement, certainly with the limits you have today, if your major adversary decides to try to build a Golden Dome. So it's not that the idea of defense is not something that is appealing. I mean, that's why Ronald Reagan talked about it. I mean, it is appealing. It's just when you try to put that idea into practice, you quickly learn that it will have unintended consequences. More money and in the end, less security.
Thanks. My son used to keep in his laboratory a poster that said, "English is important, but physics is importanter." I'm looking forward to meeting a physicist who thinks the project is feasible. I've met a number of folks from the defense industry who believe it. No physicists so far. Last quick question about China. Adam Smith and other members of the House recently visited China just this past week. Interested in visiting? Anything else you can say to encourage a more fruitful dialogue between the U.S. and China, not only on nuclear issues, but across the board?
Yes, I am. I'm not in the camp that believes that we, have to be in the equivalent of a Cold War with China. I think there's a consensus across the board on Capitol Hill that we need to be smart about China. They are a huge competitor. They're an adversary in many arenas. But we also need to make sure that we constructively engage with them in areas where we have overlapping interests. That used to include climate change, but I heard the other day that that's just a hoax. China is, you probably saw, I mean, President Xi, I think it was close after the UNGA, talked about their turbocharged efforts, actually, in terms of clean energy. And it's going to be a huge help to them in the global markets when they, continue to outpace us in many of these areas. But anyway, that's an area. Our arms control is clearly an area where we have a common interest in, again, avoiding miscalculation. And with respect to the broader relationship, I'm a believer in, engaging in diplomacy. You're not going to agree on everything. Find those areas you can agree on and pursue them. You're a former Foreign Service officer. I grew up in a Foreign Service family. I believe in the huge benefits of diplomacy. And, our national security rests on defense, diplomacy. I also think development is important. We seem to be a lot less interested in that these days with what happened at AID. But I do think when it comes to China, we should sit down with them, find common ground where possible, and manage our differences in a way that doesn't result in miscalculation.
Thank you. Before we let the senator go, let me just say to the audience as he departs, please stay in your seat for 2 or 3 minutes. Then we will have a short coffee break. And I ask you to be back in your seats for our next speaker at 1 o'clock or at the latest 1:01. Senator, thank you very much for your time and your insight.